The fireworks case was 20 pounds too light. Graham Blackstone ran his fingers along the sealed metal container one more time, checking the weight distribution. After 15 years setting up pyrotechnic displays across 3 counties, he could feel the difference between a case packed with professional-grade shells and one that had been tampered with. Problem? Victor Kelman stepped around the loading truck, clipboard in hand. The site foreman had been watching Graham for the past 10 minutes. This case shows 48 shells on the manifest. Graham tapped the inventory sticker. Feels like 32, maybe 34. Victor glanced at his paperwork. Says here it was pre-inspected at the warehouse, signed off by Harris. When? Yesterday morning, before we even got the delivery order. Graham set the case down carefully. In the fireworks business, discrepancies weren't just paperwork problems. They were safety hazards. A case light on shells could mean someone had pulled inventory for another job, or worse, that explosives were unaccounted for somewhere in the chain. You want me to call it in? Victor asked. Not yet. Graham wiped his hands on his work pants. Let me check the other cases first. But as he moved down the line of containers, Victor stepped closer and lowered his voice. Graham, this feels like a setup. The words hit like cold water. Victor had been working pyrotechnics since the early 90s. He didn't use words like setup lightly. What kind of setup? The kind where someone wants a discrepancy on record with your name attached to it. Graham straightened up. The regional fireworks show they were prepping for the Millfield County Fair was routine work, the kind of job he'd done hundreds of times. But routine jobs didn't come with pre-inspected cases that felt 20 pounds light. Who requested me specifically for this job? Victor checked his paperwork again. Came through the county procurement office. Standard bid process. And Harris signed off on the inspection? That's what it says. Graham pulled out his phone and scrolled to Harris's contact. The call went straight to voicemail. On a Wednesday afternoon, during busy season, that was unusual. Try calling the warehouse, Graham said. Ask them to pull the original inventory sheet for this shipment. Victor made the call while Graham continued checking cases. 3 more containers showed similar weight discrepancies. All had been pre-inspected by Harris. All were signed off before Graham had even been assigned to the job. Warehouse says Harris called in sick yesterday, Victor reported. Hasn't been in all week. The pieces weren't adding up. Graham had worked with Harris for 8 years. The man was methodical to a fault, the kind of inspector who counted every shell twice and logged serial numbers for inventory tracking. He didn't call in sick during county fair season, and he definitely didn't sign off on inspections he hadn't personally conducted. We're shutting this down, Graham decided. I'm not putting my license on the line for someone else's paperwork. Good call. Victor started making notes on his clipboard. I'll document everything and call the county office. Graham loaded his personal gear back into his work truck. The uneasy feeling in his stomach wasn't going away. In 15 years of professional pyrotechnics, he'd learned to trust his instincts about safety and logistics. Right now, both were telling him something was very wrong. The drive home to Cedar Ridge took 45 minutes on back roads that wound through farmland and scattered housing developments. Graham used the time to think through the day's events, the weight discrepancies, the forged inspection signatures, the convenient absence of the inspector. It all pointed to someone manipulating the system. But why target him specifically? His house sat on 2 acres at the end of Oakmont Drive, a modest ranch-style home he'd bought 12 years ago when he'd married Elena. The mortgage was almost paid off, and the property taxes weren't crushing them yet. It was the kind of middle-class stability that Graham had worked hard to build and protect. Elena's car was in the driveway, which meant she was home early from her job at the medical billing company. Their 15-year-old daughter Ruby would be at soccer practice until 6. Graham parked his work truck next to the garage and grabbed his gear bag from the passenger seat. The bag contained his personal safety equipment, work logs, and a small emergency cash stash he kept for unexpected expenses on job sites. Elena knew about the cash, but didn't know the exact amount, around $1,500 in 20s and 50s. Inside the house, Elena was standing at the kitchen counter with her laptop open, apparently working on something that required a lot of concentration. She looked up when he walked in. You're home early, she said. Everything okay? Job got postponed. Some inventory issues we need to sort out. Graham set his gear bag on the floor near the back door. How was your day? Fine. Normal. Elena closed the laptop. I'm making pasta for dinner. Ruby should be home by 6:30. Graham went to the bathroom to wash up. When he came back to the kitchen, Elena was already starting dinner preparations. She seemed cheerful, maybe too cheerful. In 12 years of marriage, he'd learned to read her moods, and something felt slightly off about her demeanor. "I'm going to grab a beer and check on some paperwork," he said. "Sure thing." Graham picked up his gear bag and headed to the small home office they'd set up in the converted spare bedroom. He dumped the contents of the bag onto the desk to reorganize everything properly. That's when he noticed the problem. The cash envelope wasn't in its usual spot at the bottom of the bag's main compartment. Graham always kept the money in a manila envelope tucked between his safety manual and his work log binder. The envelope was still there, but it had been moved to a different section of the bag. Graham opened the envelope and counted the bills. Instead of $1,500, there was $900. $600 was missing. He counted again to be sure. Definitely $900. The missing money was all in 20s, 30 bills exactly. Graham set the cash aside and examined the rest of his gear. Nothing else appeared to be missing. His safety equipment was all accounted for, his work logs were intact, and even his emergency phone charger was still in the side pocket where he'd left it. But someone had been through his bag carefully enough to find the hidden cash stash and take exactly $600. Not all of it, just enough to be significant, but not enough to empty the envelope entirely. Graham walked back to the kitchen. Elena was browning ground beef for the pasta sauce, humming quietly to herself. "Elena, did anyone come by the house today?" "No, why?" "Did you need to get anything out of my work bag for any reason?" She turned to look at him. "No. Is something wrong?" "Someone went through my gear bag. Some cash is missing." Elena's expression shifted to concern. "Missing? How much? $600? Are you sure you didn't spend it and forget?" "I'm sure." Elena turned back to the stove. "That's really strange. Maybe you should call the police." "Maybe." Graham watched her face carefully. She seemed genuinely surprised by the news, but there was something in her reaction that didn't feel completely natural. "I'm going to check around the house first, make sure there's no sign of a break-in." Graham spent the next 20 minutes examining doors, windows, and potential entry points. Everything looked secure. No scratches on locks, no damage to window frames, no footprints in the flower beds around the house. But when he checked the back door more carefully, he found something interesting. A partial shoe print in the dirt near the step, just barely visible in the late afternoon light. The print was from a high-heeled shoe, narrow, with a distinctive pattern on the sole. Graham measured the print roughly with his fingers. It was smaller than his own shoe size, but larger than what Elena typically wore. Elena was a size 7 and usually wore flats or low heels to work. This print looked like it came from a size 8 or 9 high heel. He took a photo of the print with his phone, then went back inside. "Find anything?" Elena asked. "No obvious signs of a break-in. But there's a shoe print by the back door that doesn't look familiar. Probably from the mail carrier or someone making a delivery." "Maybe." They ate dinner with Ruby when she got home from soccer practice. The conversation was normal. School, soccer, weekend plans. But Graham found himself studying Elena's behavior throughout the meal. She was definitely more talkative than usual, asking Ruby detailed questions about practice and making plans for a shopping trip on Saturday. After Ruby went upstairs to do homework, Graham helped Elena clean up the kitchen. While she loaded the dishwasher, he casually mentioned the problems at the worksite. "Some inventory discrepancies," he said. "Cases that were supposed to be inspected, but the inspector was out sick." "That sounds frustrating." "The weird part is that the inspection paperwork was already signed before I even got assigned to the job." Elena stopped loading dishes. "What does that mean?" "It means someone signed off on inventory they never actually checked. Could be fraud, could be incompetence. Either way, it's a problem." "Are you in trouble?" "Not if I document everything properly and follow protocol." Graham dried a pot and put it in the cabinet. "But it makes me wonder if someone was trying to set me up for a problem." "Set you up how?" "If I'd gone ahead with the job and the discrepancies were discovered later, it would look like I either didn't do my job properly or I was involved in..." "Whatever happened to the missing inventory?" Elena finished loading the dishwasher and started wiping down the counter. "Who would want to set you up?" "That's what I'm trying to figure out." That night, after Elena fell asleep, Graham quietly got up and went to the home office. He wanted to do some research on the day's events, starting with the inspection paperwork from the job site. But first, he decided to check something that had been nagging at him since dinner. Ruby's iPad was charging on the desk. She used it for homework and had connected it to the family's shared cloud storage for backing up school projects. Graham knew that Elena's phone was set to share location data with the family's iCloud account. primarily so they could find each other in emergencies. He'd never actually used the feature to track her movements, but tonight felt like an exception. He opened the iPad and navigated to the Find My app. Elena's phone showed up on the map with a timeline of recent locations. Most of the data points were familiar: home, her office, the grocery store, Ruby's school. But there was one location that Graham didn't recognize: a pin on Bleecker Street in the downtown business district, about 20 minutes from their house. According to the timestamp, Elena had been at that location for 2 hours the previous Thursday afternoon. Graham zoomed in on the map pin. The address corresponded to a small office building with several businesses listed in the directory. One name caught his attention: Merit Holdings, Investment Advisors. He'd never heard Elena mention anything about investment advisors or financial planning beyond their regular bank accounts and retirement savings. Why would she spend 2 hours at an investment office without mentioning it? Graham took a screenshot of the location data and closed the iPad. He was starting to see a pattern that he didn't like: the missing cash, the mysterious shoe print, the unexplained visit to an investment advisor. Taken individually, each incident could have an innocent explanation. But together, they suggested that Elena was involved in something she wasn't telling him about. The next morning, Graham called in sick to work and drove to Bleecker Street. The office building was a converted warehouse with a small parking lot and ground floor retail spaces. Merit Holdings occupied a corner suite with large windows facing the street. Graham parked across the street and studied the building. The investment advisor's office looked legitimate enough: professional signage, clean windows, and what appeared to be a small reception area visible from the street. He was about to leave when Elena's car pulled into the parking lot. Graham slumped down in his seat and watched as Elena got out of her car and walked confidently to the building entrance. She was dressed more formally than usual: a business suit he didn't recognize and high heels that could have made the print he'd found by their back door. Elena disappeared into the building. Graham noted the time: 10:15 a.m. on a Thursday. According to the location data from her phone, she'd been here at almost exactly the same time the previous week. Graham waited for 45 minutes before Elena emerged from the building, but she wasn't alone. A man in his mid-40s walked with her to the parking lot, tall, well-dressed, with the kind of confident bearing that suggested success in business. The man said something that made Elena laugh. Then he handed her what looked like a folder or envelope before getting into a BMW parked near the building entrance. Elena sat in her car for several minutes after the man left, apparently examining the contents of whatever he'd given her. Then she started her engine and drove away. Graham followed at a distance, but Elena went straight home. He waited 10 minutes before returning to the house himself. "How are you feeling?" Elena asked when he walked in. "Better than this morning?" "A little better. I think I just needed some rest." "Good. I had to run a few errands while you were sleeping." Graham nodded and went to the kitchen for coffee. Elena had said she was running errands, but she'd been at the investment advisor's office for nearly an hour, and she'd received some kind of document from the man who'd walked her to her car. That evening, while Elena was helping Ruby with homework, Graham took out the trash and made a point of examining the contents of the kitchen garbage can. Near the bottom, underneath coffee grounds and food scraps, he found a crumpled legal-sized envelope. Graham smoothed out the envelope carefully. It was addressed to Mr. and Mrs. Graham Blackstone and came from Pinnacle Home Lending. Inside was a refinancing proposal for their house, a document that included Graham's signature on several pages. The problem was that Graham had never seen the document before, and he definitely hadn't signed it. The signature looked convincing at first glance, but Graham knew his own handwriting well enough to spot the subtle differences. Someone had forged his signature with considerable skill, but they'd gotten the angle of his G slightly wrong and made the final stroke of his last name too curved. Graham photographed each page of the document with his phone, then carefully returned it to the trash. The refinancing proposal was for a significant amount, enough to access nearly all of the equity they'd built up in the house over 12 years of mortgage payments. If Elena had signed and submitted the paperwork with his forged signature, she could potentially access tens of thousands of dollars without his knowledge or consent. The money would appear to be a legitimate loan secured by their jointly owned home. Graham spent the rest of the evening acting normally while his mind raced through the implications. Elena was clearly involved with someone at Merit Holdings who had access to sophisticated financial documents and the ability to forge signatures convincingly. The missing cash from his gear bag could have been a test, a way to see if he was paying close attention to their finances. The next morning, Graham called their bank and asked to review their account activity online. Everything looked normal in their checking and savings accounts. But when he accessed their home equity line of credit, he found a recent withdrawal of $24,000. The withdrawal was dated 3 days ago, the same day Elena had visited Merit Holdings for the second time. According to the bank's records, the transaction had been initiated online using both Graham's and Elena's login credentials. Graham knew he hadn't authorized any withdrawal from their HELOC. He rarely even checked the account, since they'd only used it once before for a major home repair project 5 years ago. But someone with access to their joint financial information could have initiated the withdrawal if they had the right account numbers and security credentials. Elena had that access as his spouse, and she also handled most of their routine banking and bill paying. Graham closed the laptop and tried to think through his options. Confronting Elena directly would tip her off that he knew something was wrong, but it might not get him the whole truth about what she was involved in. Going to the police would require proof of fraud, which he didn't have yet. Just suspicious circumstances and a forged signature on a document that had been thrown away. What he needed was more information about Merit Holdings and the man he'd seen with Elena, and he needed to understand the scope of whatever financial scheme was unfolding. Graham drove back to Bleecker Street and parked where he could observe the investment office. Over the next 3 hours, he watched several people enter and leave the building. Most appeared to be routine business visitors, but one man caught his attention. Around 2 p.m., a heavy-set man in an expensive suit spent nearly an hour in the Merit Holdings office. When he left, he was clearly agitated, walking quickly, talking on his phone in what appeared to be an animated conversation. Graham managed to get a photo of the man's license plate as he drove away. Later, using the County Property Records website, he was able to trace the plate number to a local restaurant owner named Frank Castellano. A quick online search revealed that Castellano had been involved in a lawsuit the previous year over a failed real estate investment. The case had been settled out of court, but the public records showed that he'd lost a significant amount of money in what was described as a fraudulent investment scheme. Graham was starting to understand the pattern. Merit Holdings appeared to be targeting people for sophisticated financial fraud, possibly using forged documents and identity theft to access their assets. Elena had somehow become involved in the scheme, either as a sufferer or as a participant. But Graham still didn't know why Elena would risk their marriage and their financial security for whatever money she might be getting from the arrangement. They weren't wealthy, but they weren't desperate either. Their mortgage payments were manageable, Ruby's college fund was growing steadily, and they had enough savings to handle most emergencies, unless Elena was in the kind of trouble that required immediate access to large amounts of cash. That evening, Graham decided to test his theory. Over dinner, he casually mentioned that he'd been thinking about their financial planning. "I was looking at our retirement accounts today," he said. "We're in pretty good shape, but I think we should probably talk to a financial advisor about maximizing our investment strategy." Elena's reaction was immediate and subtle. She stopped eating for just a moment, and her expression shifted before she recovered her composure. "That sounds like a good idea," she said. "Do you have someone in mind?" "I was thinking about doing some research first. Maybe look at investment advisors in the area, see who has the best reputation." "I could help with that if you want. I've gotten pretty good at research from work." "Thanks. I'll let you know what I find." After dinner, Elena seemed distracted and went to bed earlier than usual. Graham waited until he was sure she was asleep, then went to the home office and did some serious research on Silas Merritt and Merit Holdings. What he found was troubling. Silas Merritt had been a practicing attorney until 2018, when he'd been disbarred for client trust fund violations. Since then, he'd been involved in several real estate ventures that had ended badly for investors. County court records showed that Merritt had been sued at least 4 times in the past 3 years for various forms of financial misconduct. Most of the cases had been settled out of court, but the pattern was clear. Merritt specialized in elaborate scams that targeted middle-class property owners. Graham also found something else interesting. In several of the court filings, Merritt had been represented by the same law firm that handled real estate closings for major developments in the county. The firm had connections to local banks, title companies, and municipal offices, the kind of connections that could facilitate complex document fraud. It was nearly 2 a.m. when Graham finally closed the laptop. He now understood that Elena was involved with someone who had both the motivation and the capability to orchestrate sophisticated financial crimes. The forged refinancing documents and the HELOC withdrawal were probably just the beginning. Graham needed help, but he also needed to be careful. If he moved too quickly or too obviously, Elena and her associates could potentially drain their remaining assets and disappear. If he moved too slowly, He might find himself facing criminal charges as an unwitting accomplice to fraud. The next morning, Graham called Tom Hesse, a civil attorney he'd worked with years ago on a contract dispute with a previous employer. Graham explained the situation in general terms, without mentioning Elena by name. "What you're describing sounds like a sophisticated identity theft and document fraud scheme," Tom said. "The perpetrators are probably targeting couples with significant home equity and good credit histories. What would you recommend for someone in this situation? Document everything, but don't confront the suspected spouse directly. These schemes usually involve multiple sufferers and significant amounts of money. If your information leads to criminal charges, you want to be clearly established as a sufferer rather than a potential co-conspirator. What about protecting assets that haven't been compromised yet? That's where it gets tricky. If you start moving money or changing account access, it could tip off the fraudsters. But if you don't act, you could lose everything." Tom suggested a strategy that would give Graham some protection while gathering more evidence. They would create a legitimate business entity, a partnership related to Graham's fireworks business, that would require Elena's signature on various documents. If Elena signed without reading carefully, Graham would have legal grounds to claim that she'd unknowingly transferred certain assets into his sole control. "It's not foolproof," Tom warned, "but it gives you some legal cover and might slow down whatever scheme is already in progress." Graham spent the weekend setting up the business partnership paperwork. He created documents that looked like routine expansion of his pyrotechnics business, but actually established him as the sole managing partner of any jointly owned assets that were transferred into the business entity. On Monday evening, Graham presented the paperwork to Elena as a legitimate business opportunity. "I've been thinking about expanding the fireworks business," he said. "Maybe bidding on some larger contracts, possibly buying some equipment. Tom helped me set up a partnership structure that would give us some tax advantages." Elena looked through the documents casually. "This looks pretty complicated. Most of it is just legal boilerplate. The important part is that it establishes the business as a separate entity for tax purposes, and it allows us to write off some of our property expenses as business costs." "Do I need to sign anything?" "Just a few pages where we're transferring some of our joint assets into the business entity. It's mainly for liability protection." Elena signed the documents without reading them carefully. Graham watched her pen move across the signature lines, officially transferring their home equity line of credit and 2 investment accounts into a business partnership where Graham had sole management authority. "Thanks," Graham said, collecting the signed documents. "Tom says this should save us a couple $1,000s a year in taxes." "That's great. Every little bit helps." But Graham noticed that Elena seemed distracted during the conversation, checking her phone several times and appearing to be waiting for something. Around 9 p.m., Elena announced that she needed to run to the store for groceries. "At this time of night?" Graham asked. "I want to get the shopping done before the weekend rush. I'll be back in an hour." Elena left, but Graham had a strong suspicion that she wasn't going grocery shopping. He waited 15 minutes, then drove to Bleecker Street to see if Elena's car was at the Merritt Holdings office. The office building was mostly dark, but Elena's car was in the parking lot along with the BMW that belonged to the man Graham had seen her with before. There was also a third vehicle, a pickup truck that Graham didn't recognize. Graham parked across the street and settled in to wait. Through the windows of the investment office, he could see several people moving around, apparently having some kind of meeting. After about 40 minutes, the meeting appeared to break up. Elena and the man in the business suit came out of the building together, followed by a third person, a woman Graham didn't recognize. But then Graham saw something that changed everything. The third person was Victor Kellman, the site foreman from the fireworks job. Victor, who had warned Graham about the setup with the inventory discrepancies. Victor, who had access to Graham's work schedule and job assignments. Victor, who could have provided Elena with information about Graham's work habits and financial situation. Graham watched as Victor shook hands with the other man and got into his pickup truck. Elena and the businessman talked for a few more minutes before getting into their respective cars and leaving in different directions. Graham now understood the full scope of what was happening. Elena wasn't just involved with a random financial fraud scheme. She was working with someone who had inside access to Graham's professional life. Victor could have arranged for the inventory discrepancies that had nearly gotten Graham into trouble. Victor knew when Graham would be away from home for work, giving Elena opportunities to meet with her associates without raising suspicion. And Victor had been in a position to go through Graham's work gear and take the cash from his bag. testing whether Graham was paying attention to details that might expose the larger scheme. Graham drove home and waited for Elena to return. She came back around 10:45 p.m. with a small bag of groceries, just enough to support her story about going to the store. "How was the shopping?" Graham asked. "Fine. Pretty quiet for a Monday night." Graham spent the next several days quietly documenting Elena's activities and gathering information about the people she was working with. He used the location data from her phone to establish a pattern of regular meetings with Silas Merritt, and he took photographs of Elena, Victor, and Merritt together outside the Bleecker Street office. But Graham also started preparing for a more direct confrontation. Tom Hesse had helped him establish legal control over their major assets, but Graham knew that Elena and her associates wouldn't give up easily once they realized their scheme had been discovered. On Thursday evening, Graham decided it was time to make his move. He drove to Bleecker Street early and positioned himself where he could observe the Merritt Holdings office. As expected, Elena arrived around 6 p.m. for what had become her weekly meeting. But this time, Graham didn't just watch from a distance. After Elena had been inside for about 20 minutes, he walked to the office building and entered through the main door. The building directory showed that Merritt Holdings was in Suite 3B. Graham took the stairs to the third floor and found the office door, which was marked with professional-looking signage. Through the frosted glass panel next to the door, Graham could see several people seated around what appeared to be a conference table. He recognized Elena's voice, along with two male voices, one of which belonged to Silas Merritt. Graham pressed his ear to the door and listened carefully. The conversation was focused on something called the Blackstone property transfer, which Graham realized was a reference to his own house. "The paperwork should be finalized by next week," Merritt was saying. "Once we have clear title, we can move forward with the sale to the development company." "What about Graham?" Elena asked. "He's been asking questions about our finances. That's why we moved up the timeline. By the time he figures out what's happened, the property will be sold and the money will be offshore." Graham had heard enough. Elena and Merritt were planning to steal his house through fraudulent document transfers, then sell it to a development company and split the proceeds. The business partnership documents Elena had signed earlier in the week were probably intended to facilitate the property transfer by establishing her legal authority to act on behalf of their jointly owned assets. But Graham had a significant advantage that Elena didn't know about. The partnership documents she'd signed actually gave Graham sole control over the property, not Elena. If she tried to transfer the house title without his explicit consent, she would be committing fraud using documents that had no legal validity. Graham quietly left the building and drove home. He spent the evening acting normally, helping Ruby with homework and watching television with Elena. But internally, he was planning his next moves carefully. The next morning, Graham met with Tom Hesse to review his legal options. "Based on what you've told me, your wife is involved in a conspiracy to defraud you of your primary residence," Tom said. "The good news is that the partnership documents she signed actually protect you from most of the potential damage. The bad news is that she's probably committed several felonies already. What do you recommend? We need to get ahead of this before they attempt the property transfer. I'll file an emergency motion to freeze any transactions involving your jointly owned assets, and I'll notify the district attorney's office about the suspected fraud." "What about Elena?" "That depends on whether you want to try to work this out privately or whether you want to pursue criminal charges." Graham thought about the question carefully. Elena had betrayed their marriage and their financial security, but she was also Ruby's mother. Whatever legal consequences Elena faced would affect their daughter as well. "Let me try to resolve this directly first," Graham decided. "If that doesn't work, we'll proceed with criminal charges." That evening, Graham decided to confront Elena, but he wanted to do it in a way that would give her a chance to explain herself and potentially cooperate in unwinding whatever damage had already been done. He waited until Ruby was at soccer practice, then sat Elena down in the living room for a serious conversation. "Elena, I know about Silas Merritt and the meetings at Bleecker Street." Elena's face went completely white. "I don't know what you're talking about. I know about the forged refinancing documents, the HELOC withdrawal, and the plan to transfer the house title. I also know that Victor Kelman is involved." Elena stared at him for a long moment. Then her composure completely collapsed. She started crying and shaking, unable to form coherent words. Graham waited for her to calm down enough to speak. "How did you find out?" she finally asked. "I've been tracking your movements and documenting the evidence for 2 weeks. The question is why you got involved in this scheme in the first place." Elena wiped her eyes and looked at Graham with an expression of desperation and shame. "I owe money to some people who don't accept late payments," she said. "A lot of money. What kind of people? I started gambling online about 6 months ago. Just small amounts at first, but I kept losing and trying to win it back. I ended up borrowing money from a loan company that charges extremely high interest rates. Graham felt his stomach drop. How much money? $40,000 plus interest and penalties. They want $60,000 total, and they've made it clear what happens to people who don't pay. The numbers were staggering. Elena had accumulated debt equal to more than half of Graham's annual income, and she'd hidden it completely from him for months. So you got involved with Merritt to steal our house and use the money to pay off gambling debts? It wasn't supposed to be stealing. Silas said we could refinance the house for enough money to pay off my debts, and then we could make the mortgage payments from his investment returns. He said it was a temporary arrangement that would solve my problem without affecting you. Elena, the man is a convicted fraudster. He was disbarred for stealing money from clients. I know that now, but when I first met him, he seemed legitimate, and I was desperate. Graham tried to process the full scope of the situation. Elena had not only betrayed their marriage by lying about her gambling obsession, but she'd also gotten involved with criminals who were now threatening both of their safety and financial security. What exactly did you agree to do for Merritt? I was supposed to provide him with information about our finances and help him prepare documents that would give him temporary access to our home equity. He said he could turn $24,000 into enough money to pay off my debts within a few months. And Victor? How did he get involved? Victor approached me at a company picnic last year. He said he knew about my gambling because he'd seen me at the casino. He offered to help me find a way to pay off my debts without you finding out. Graham realized that Victor had been planning this scheme for months, carefully positioning himself to manipulate both Elena's desperation and Graham's professional situation. Elena, these people are criminals. They were never going to help you pay off your debts. They were planning to steal our house, sell it to a development company, and disappear with the money. What do you mean? Graham explained what he'd overheard at the Merritt Holdings office. Elena's face went from shame to horror as she realized that she'd been used as an unwitting accomplice in a scheme to steal everything they'd worked for over 12 years of marriage. What can we do? She asked. I've already taken legal steps to protect our assets. The partnership documents you signed last week actually transferred control of our major accounts to me, not to Merritt. If he tries to access our money now, he'll be committing fraud. You tricked me into signing those documents? I protected us from the consequences of your bad decisions. The question now is whether you're willing to help me stop Merritt and Victor before they find another way to hurt our family. Elena was quiet for several minutes, apparently trying to absorb the full implications of what Graham had told her. What would I have to do? Cooperate with law enforcement and help them gather evidence against Merritt and Victor. In exchange, the prosecutor might be willing to consider you as a sufferer of the scheme rather than a co-conspirator. And if I don't cooperate, then you'll probably be facing fraud charges along with Merritt and Victor. Elena agreed to cooperate, but Graham could see that she was still holding something back. That evening, after Ruby went to bed, he pressed her for more details about her involvement with the scheme. There's something else you're not telling me, Graham said. Elena looked at him with an expression of complete defeat. Silas wants me to do something else, she said. Something that would make it impossible for you to stop the property transfer. What kind of something? He wants me to sign papers that would have you declared mentally incompetent to manage our finances. The documents would give me power of attorney to act on your behalf for all legal and financial matters. Graham felt a chill run through him. If Elena signed documents claiming that he was mentally incompetent, Merritt could potentially use that as justification for any financial transactions he wanted to make. Graham could find himself legally powerless to stop the theft of his own assets. When are you supposed to sign these documents? Tomorrow night. Silas is having a dinner meeting with some investors, and he wants me to bring the signed papers. Graham realized that this was an opportunity to gather evidence against Merritt and potentially catch him in the act of soliciting fraud. Elena, I want you to go to that dinner meeting. But you're going to be wearing a recording device, and you're not going to sign anything. What if Silas gets suspicious? Tell him you want to review the documents with a lawyer first. That will buy us time to set up the recording and coordinate with law enforcement. The next day, Graham met with Tom Hesse and Detective Sarah Morrison from the County Fraud Unit. Detective Morrison was experienced in financial crimes and immediately understood the complexity of the scheme Graham was describing. This sounds like a sophisticated operation, she said. If we can get recordings of Merritt soliciting document fraud, we'll have enough evidence for criminal charges against everyone involved. They fitted Elena with a small recording device and gave her specific instructions about what to say and do. During the dinner meeting, the plan was for Elena to encourage Merritt to explain the full scope of his scheme, while law enforcement officers positioned themselves outside the restaurant. Remember, you're trying to get him to admit that he's planning to use forged documents to steal property, Detective Morrison told Elena. The more specific details he provides, the stronger our case will be. The dinner meeting was scheduled for 7 p.m. at an upscale restaurant downtown. Graham and Detective Morrison parked across the street where they could observe the entrance while listening to the audio feed from Elena's recording device. Elena arrived at the restaurant on time and was seated at a table with Silas Merritt and two other men Graham didn't recognize. Based on their conversation, the other men appeared to be investors in Merritt's various real estate schemes. For the first 30 minutes, the conversation was routine business discussion about property values and development opportunities. But as the evening progressed, Merritt became more specific about his methods. The key to this business is understanding how to work within the legal system, Merritt explained to his dinner companions. Most property owners don't really understand the documents they're signing, especially when you present them in the right context. What do you mean by the right context? One of the investors asked. For example, if someone is facing financial pressure, they're much more likely to sign documents without reading them carefully, especially if you frame the transaction as a solution to their immediate problem. Elena spoke up. Like the power of attorney documents you want me to sign? Exactly. Your husband thinks he's in control of your finances, but once you sign those documents, you'll have legal authority to act on his behalf for any financial transaction. He won't be able to stop us from accessing the full equity in your property. Graham and Detective Morrison exchanged glances. Merritt had just admitted to conspiracy to commit fraud, and it was all being recorded. But Merritt wasn't finished explaining his methods. The beauty of this approach is that everything appears completely legal on the surface, he continued. We're not breaking into anyone's house or forging signatures. We're simply using legitimate legal documents to transfer property from people who don't understand the system to people who do. What about the husband? The second investor asked. What happens when he figures out what's going on? By the time he understands what's happened, the property will already be sold and the money will be in offshore accounts. He can file complaints and lawsuits all he wants, but the legal process takes years and will be long gone. Elena asked the question that Detective Morrison had coached her to ask. What if Graham tries to stop the property transfer before we complete the sale? That's why we moved up the timeline, Merritt said. Victor has already planted evidence that will make Graham look like he's involved in the fireworks inventory theft. If he tries to cause problems for us, we'll simply provide the authorities with evidence that he's been stealing explosives and selling them on the black market. Graham felt his blood pressure spike. Victor had not only helped Elena get involved with Merritt's scheme, but he'd also set Graham up to take the fall for the inventory discrepancies at the worksite. What kind of evidence? Elena asked. Forged inventory logs that show Graham signing off on shipments that were 20 pounds light on explosives. Victor made sure Graham's signature was on all the right documents, and we have witnesses who will testify that Graham was acting suspiciously during the inventory process. Detective Morrison was taking notes frantically. Merritt was confessing to multiple felonies, including conspiracy to commit fraud, identity theft, and filing false police reports. The dinner conversation continued for another hour, with Merritt providing more details about his methods and his plans for the money from the property sale. By the time the meeting ended, law enforcement had recorded enough evidence to support criminal charges against Merritt, Victor, and potentially several other people involved in the scheme. Elena left the restaurant without signing any documents, telling Merritt that she needed more time to think about the power of attorney paperwork. Merritt seemed satisfied with her explanation and told her to call him when she was ready to proceed. The next morning, Detective Morrison obtained arrest warrants for Silas Merritt and Victor Kelman. Both men were taken into custody before they could realize that Elena had been cooperating with law enforcement. Graham felt a mixture of relief and anger as he watched Victor being arrested at the fireworks warehouse. The man had been planning to destroy Graham's career and reputation as part of an elaborate theft scheme. But Graham's relief was tempered by the realization that his marriage was effectively over. Elena had betrayed him in ways that went far beyond the financial fraud. She'd gambled away their financial security, lied to him for months, and conspired with criminals to steal their home. The legal proceedings moved quickly once Merritt and Victor were arrested. Both men decided to cooperate with prosecutors in hopes of receiving reduced sentences. Their testimony revealed the full scope of the fraud scheme, which had targeted at least 12 other families in the county over the past 2 years. Elena was charged with conspiracy to commit fraud, but her cooperation with law enforcement resulted in a plea agreement that avoided jail time in exchange for restitution payments and community service. The criminal case also revealed the extent of Elena's gambling obsession. Bank records showed that she'd lost over $60,000 in online gambling over an 8-month period, using credit cards, personal loans, and eventually cash advances from carnivory lenders. Graham filed for divorce 3 weeks after Elena's arrest. The proceedings were complicated by the financial fraud case, but Tom Hesse was able to protect Graham's interests by demonstrating that Elena had acted without his knowledge or consent in all of the fraudulent transactions. Ruby took the divorce and Elena's legal troubles hard, but Graham worked to maintain a stable home environment for his daughter, while Elena served her community service sentence and attended mandatory gambling obsession treatment. 6 months after the arrests, Graham received a call from Detective Morrison with an unexpected update. "We've recovered most of the money from your home equity line of credit," she said. "Merritt was keeping it in accounts we were able to trace and freeze. You should be able to get back about $18,000 of the $24,000 that was stolen." The financial recovery was helpful, but Graham knew that the real damage from Elena's betrayal couldn't be measured in dollars. Their marriage was over, their family was broken, and Ruby would have to deal with the consequences of her mother's choices for years to come. But Graham also realized that he'd learned something important about himself during the crisis. When faced with a complex threat to everything he'd worked for, he'd been able to think strategically, act decisively, and protect what mattered most. As he sat in his home office on a quiet Sunday afternoon, organizing the legal documents that had resolved the fraud case, Graham reflected on the difference between the life he'd thought he was living and the reality that had been hidden from him. He'd believed that his marriage was solid, his finances were secure, and his biggest professional worry was maintaining safety standards for fireworks displays. The truth was that he'd been living one bad decision away from losing everything, and he'd been completely unaware of the danger. But Graham had also learned that he was capable of protecting himself and his daughter when it really mattered. The strategic thinking that made him good at planning fireworks shows had also helped him outmaneuver people who were trying to destroy his life. A year later, Graham was sitting in the same restaurant where Merritt had confessed to his crimes. But this time, he was having dinner with Ruby to celebrate her 16th birthday. "Dad, can I ask you something?" Ruby said as they waited for dessert. "Of course." "Are you glad that everything happened the way it did? I mean, with Mom and the divorce and everything?" Graham thought about the question carefully. The past year had been difficult in ways he'd never imagined, but it had also shown him what was truly important in his life. "I'm glad we found out the truth before it was too late to do something about it," he said. "And I'm glad that you and I came through it together." Ruby smiled. "Me too." Graham looked around the restaurant, remembering the night when he'd sat in a surveillance car outside, listening to Elena's recording device as Merritt confessed to planning the theft of their home. It seemed like a lifetime ago, but it had only been 12 months. The difference was that Graham now understood the value of paying attention to details that most people ignored. The weight of a fireworks case, the location data on a phone, the subtle changes in someone's behavior that indicated they were hiding something important. He built a new life based on that understanding, and he was confident that he'd never be caught off guard again. As they left the restaurant, Ruby asked if they could drive past the old house on Oakmont Drive. Graham had sold the property 6 months earlier and used the proceeds to buy a smaller house in a different neighborhood, a fresh start that didn't carry the emotional weight of Elena's betrayal. "Sure," Graham said, "but just for a minute." They drove slowly past the house where Graham had lived for 12 years, where he'd raised Ruby from age 3 to 15, where he'd believed his marriage was solid and his future was secure. The new owners had already made changes to the landscaping and painted the front door a different color. It looked like a completely different place from the home Graham remembered. "Do you miss it?" Ruby asked. "Sometimes, but mostly I'm grateful that we got out before we lost everything." Ruby was quiet for a moment as they drove away from the old neighborhood. "Dad, what happened to Victor and Mr. Merritt?" "Victor got 3 years in federal prison for fraud and conspiracy. Merritt got 7 years because he was the ringleader and because he had previous convictions. And Mom? She's doing well. The gambling treatment program really helped her, and she's working at a new job in the city. You'll see her next weekend." Graham had worked hard to maintain a civil relationship with Elena for Ruby's sake. The divorce had been painful and complicated, but they'd managed to establish a custody arrangement that gave Ruby stability and regular contact with both parents. Elena was living in a small apartment 40 minutes away, working as a bookkeeper for a medical practice and attending weekly meetings for gambling obsession. She was paying restitution to the sufferers of Merritt's fraud scheme and would be doing community service for 2 more years. But Elena was also rebuilding her life in a way that seemed genuine. She'd admitted her mistakes, accepted responsibility for the consequences, and was working to earn back Ruby's trust through consistent actions rather than promises. Graham respected Elena's efforts to change, but he also knew that he could never trust her the way he had during their marriage. Too much had been broken, and some damage couldn't be repaired. As they drove home to their new house, Graham thought about the fireworks display he was scheduled to set up the following weekend. It was a wedding celebration for a young couple who reminded him of himself and Elena 15 years ago, full of optimism about their future together, confident that their love could overcome any challenge. Graham hoped their optimism would prove justified. But he also knew that marriage was more fragile than most people realized, and that financial security was often just an illusion maintained by people who weren't paying close enough attention to the details. The fireworks business had taught Graham that spectacular displays required careful planning, precise timing, and constant attention to safety protocols. Life, he'd learned, wasn't much different. The following week, Graham was setting up equipment for the wedding fireworks show when his phone rang. The caller ID showed Detective Morrison's number. "Graham, I wanted to give you an update on something that might interest you," she said. "We've uncovered evidence that Merritt's scheme was much larger than we originally thought. He may have defrauded sufferers in 3 other counties over the past 5 years. How much money are we talking about? Potentially over $2 million. The FBI is taking over the investigation, and they might need you to testify about the methods Merritt used in your case." Graham agreed to cooperate with the federal investigation. Part of him was satisfied to know that Merritt would face additional consequences for his crimes, but mostly he was focused on moving forward with his own life. That evening, as Graham finished preparing for the wedding fireworks show, he received a text message from an unknown number. "This isn't over, Blackstone. You cost me everything, and I don't forget." Graham stared at the message for a moment, then forwarded it to Detective Morrison. He suspected it had come from either Victor or someone associated with Merritt's scheme, but he wasn't going to let anonymous threats intimidate him. Graham had learned that the best response to people who tried to manipulate or threaten him was to document their behavior and respond through proper legal channels. He'd spent too much time rebuilding his life to let criminals disrupt his peace of mind. The wedding fireworks show went perfectly. As Graham watched the finale burst across the night sky, he thought about the difference between controlled explosions and the kind of chaos that people like Merritt and Victor created in other people's lives. Fireworks were spectacular precisely because they were planned, timed, and executed with safety as the top priority. The beauty came from the combination of artistry and technical precision. Fraud, by contrast, was just destruction disguised as opportunity. It created the illusion of spectacular results while actually destroying everything it touched. Graham packed up his equipment and drove home to the new house where Ruby was waiting with homework questions and stories about her day at school. It was a quiet, normal evening, the kind of stability that Graham had learned not to take for granted. 6 months later, Graham received a call from Tom Hesse with news about the federal investigation. "Merritt just pleaded guilty to 23 counts of federal fraud," Tom reported. "He's looking at 15 to 20 years in federal prison." Victor got an additional 2 years added to his sentence for his role in the larger scheme. "What about the other sufferers?" "The FBI has been able to recover about 60% of the stolen money. Most of the families affected by the scheme will get at least partial restitution." Graham was glad to hear that justice was being served and that other sufferers would recover some of their losses, but he was also ready to put the entire experience behind him and focus on the future. That future included a new relationship with Sarah Chen, a teacher at Ruby's school who had become a close friend during the difficult months of the divorce proceedings. Sarah was patient, intelligent, and refreshingly straightforward, qualities that Graham had learned to value highly. Ruby approved of Sarah, which meant a lot to Graham. His daughter had been through enough upheaval, and he wasn't going to introduce any additional complications into their lives unless he was confident about the relationship's long-term potential. On a Saturday afternoon in early spring, Graham was working in the garage of their new house when Ruby came out to help him organize his fireworks equipment. "Dad, can I ask you something about Mom?" she said, as they sorted through inventory sheets. "Sure. Do you think she would have kept lying to you if you hadn't figured out what she was doing?" Graham considered the question carefully. It was the kind of complicated moral inquiry that Ruby had been wrestling with as she tried to understand her mother's choices. I think your mom got trapped in a situation where lying seemed easier than telling the truth, Graham said. But lies have a way of getting bigger and more complicated over time. Eventually, she would have had to choose between confessing everything or losing everything. Do you think she really changed, or is she just better at hiding things now? I think she learned that the consequences of lying are worse than the consequences of telling the truth. That's a hard lesson, but it's an important one. Ruby was quiet for a few minutes as they continued organizing equipment. I'm glad you figured it out, she said finally, even though everything got really complicated for a while. Me too. That evening, Graham made dinner for Ruby and Sarah, and they spent the night playing board games and talking about summer vacation plans. It was the kind of simple family evening that Graham had missed during the chaos of the fraud investigation and divorce proceedings. As he watched Ruby and Sarah laugh at something silly that had happened during their Monopoly game, Graham realized that he'd built something better than what he'd lost. His new life was based on honesty, awareness, and careful attention to the details that really mattered. The fireworks business was thriving because Graham had developed a reputation for reliability and safety. His relationship with Sarah was growing stronger because they communicated honestly about their expectations and concerns. And his relationship with Ruby was deeper than it had ever been because they'd been through a crisis together and emerged with greater trust and understanding. 6 months after that quiet family evening, Graham was preparing for the biggest fireworks display of his career, a 4th of July celebration for the entire county that would require weeks of planning and coordination. As he reviewed the safety protocols and timing schedules, Graham thought about how much his life had changed since the day he'd first noticed that a fireworks case was 20 pounds too light. That small discrepancy had led him to uncover a conspiracy that threatened everything he cared about, but it had also taught him skills and perspectives that made him stronger and more resilient. The county fireworks display went off without any problems. 20,000 people watched from the park as Graham's carefully choreographed show lit up the night sky for 30 minutes of patriotic celebration. After the last shell exploded and the crowd began to disperse, Graham stood alone on the launch platform, looking out over the empty field where his equipment was scattered. Tomorrow, he would spend the day cleaning up and packing everything for the next job. But tonight, he allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. He'd built a successful business, raised a remarkable daughter, found a woman who made him genuinely happy, and survived a conspiracy that could have destroyed his life. Graham's phone buzzed with a text message from Sarah. Amazing show. Ruby and I are so proud of you. He smiled and typed back, thanks. On my way home. As Graham packed up his equipment and prepared to leave the launch site, he thought about the fuse switch that had started it all, the small detail that most people would have ignored, but that had saved his family from financial ruin. In the fireworks business, timing was everything. Light the fuse too early and you'd ruin the sequence. Light it too late and you'd miss the moment entirely. Life, Graham had learned, operated on similar principles. Pay attention to the small details, trust your instincts when something felt wrong, and act decisively when action was required. Graham drove home through quiet suburban streets, past houses where families were settling in for the night after watching his fireworks display. Most of those families probably thought their lives were secure. Their relationships were honest, and their financial futures were protected by good intentions and hard work. Graham hoped they were right, but he also knew that security was something you had to actively maintain, not something you could take for granted. At the new house on Maple Street, Sarah and Ruby were waiting with leftover pizza and stories about the evening's celebration. Ruby had invited 3 friends to watch the fireworks from their backyard, and Sarah had documented the entire event with her camera. The finale was incredible, Ruby said as she showed Graham photos of the night sky filled with colorful explosions. Everyone said it was the best fireworks show they'd ever seen. Graham looked at the photos and remembered the moment when he'd triggered the finale sequence. Dozens of shells launching simultaneously, filling the sky with light and sound that could be seen for miles. It was a controlled explosion, carefully planned and precisely executed. Beautiful, powerful, and safe. Graham Blackstone had learned to appreciate the difference.